ACL rehab, really looking at optimizing months 4 through 9, and really taking athletes to like the ultimate, get back to their sport, but hopefully better than they were even before, right? So a little bit of background about me before we get going into the content. Um, I am the director of performance at Champion PT and Performance up in the Boston area, like Adam mentioned. I consider myself a teacher and a mentor, right? I mentor all of our staff, all of our interns. Um, I've got a little over 12 years of experience in the SNC world, right? And the thing that really started to get me, diving deep into some of this stuff was I was actually, working on redesigning our entire ACL return to sport program at Champion. So it was a cool opportunity to take lead on that, collaborate with a lot of our PTs, collaborate with the rest of the strength staff over at Champion, and just get this thing rolling and kind of redesign the way that we think about ACL rehab. And then lastly, this is a little ode to my wife, but she calls me a professional yapper. Apparently, I like to yap and just chop it up. So that's hopefully what I'm going to do a little bit of today. But let's kind of jump in. So I always, for every presentation that I do, I like starting with the goal in mind, right? What are we trying to get accomplished today? So the goal for today is I want to give you guys a little bit of insight into the structure and the organization of a good return to sport system that's based on science, and it's based on success through trial and error, right? Keep in mind that it's an insight. We only have an hour to talk about this stuff. This is probably a multi-day, multi-month kind of thing if you really want to master ACLs, but hopefully I can give you guys some good insight today. Right. And then I would say the more important one actually is we're talking ACL return to sport. So what's our goal with all of our athletes, right? And the way that I like to think about it, and Adam alluded to this a little bit, is my goal is to get my athletes back to their sport better than they've ever been, right? Not just back on the field and operating at good enough, but I really want to get my athletes back on the field, on the ice, on the court, whatever it is, and see if I can get them to be better than they've ever been, right, physiologically. So talking through that, the next thing is how are we going to lay this out, right? The way that I've always kind of thought about it is I like reverse engineering the finished product and kind of working my way backwards and then seeing if all of the steps line up so that if we were to go back into the positive direction, it all lines up as a nice progression. Okay. So here's the first thing we're going to start off with. So a little bit of a case study type thing to start off with. But in a classic field sport demand, right? Envision soccer, lacrosse, field hockey, rugby, whatever field sport athlete that you're working with, you're likely going to have to worry about all these different qualities of athleticism as far as getting an athlete back on the field. And like I said earlier, performing better than they've ever performed before. So a couple of things that we're going to really, touch on is we got to make sure that we're getting athletes back to max acceleration. We got to make sure athletes are able to hit top speeds when they need to. They got to be able to change directions on a dime. They have to be able to show agility in very tight spaces and probably have a pretty, a high level of reaction time and all that stuff involved. We got to be able to rotate on a fixed femur, and we know how stressful that is on an ACL. We got to make sure that we develop some retreating skills and some hip swiveling. We got to be able to develop the capacity to sustain a lot of these outputs and efforts over the course of a game. And then we got to be able to have the ability to put it all together when it comes to reacting over a visual, auditory, tactile cue that the opponent or someone on the other side of the field is reacting to as well. Okay, so this stuff gets pretty complicated, meaning there's a lot to work through and there's a lot to develop over the course of an ACL rehab program, right? So what I want to do real quick is I want to show you guys some examples of some of the demands that we're looking at. So I actually pulled up some footage. I asked some of my athletes to send me some of their in-game footage so we can actually look through some of these examples. So this is one of my athletes. He's a Division I lacrosse player, but as you can kind of see, all the maneuvering and tight spaces that he's got to do, the being able to change directions, to be able to take contact, come down and be safe. Well, he's got to get back to doing that after an ACL surgery. And then I have another one here, same exact athlete, but you're going to see a really, really sharp jab step, cutting and changing direction actually fools the camera person, and then he's able to get a shot across, right? So another really good high level example. And then my other one, I actually have one of my collegiate gymnasts who was actually on the national team for a little bit, but he was another ACL victim. But his demands are being able to really springboard off of that instead of landing at the highest amount of per body weight ratio first, right? So all these different demands are things that we have to prep our athletes for. So a big chunk of what I take a ton of pride in is making sure that we're able to get back to this and ideally better. Okay. So let's actually get into reversing this process, like I mentioned. Okay. So we're going to actually start at month 9, right? I don't want to start at what are we going to do month 4 and then build up to month 5. I'm going to, like I said, completely reverse engineer the process. So at month 9, we're really starting to get athletes back to having the conversation of, hey, are we ready to get back into the sport, right? So we need to make sure that we feel good about the fact that we've exposed all of our athletes to all the physical demands, similar to what you guys just saw. And then from a training perspective, going back to those qualities that I mentioned in that list earlier, we got to make sure that our training has, up to this point, involved high velocity, high power output, high braking, high body control, multi-directional work with the reaction, and all the other things that you saw in a couple of those lacrosse videos, and then the really high forces that you saw in that gymnastics video. What I want to quickly do is at month 9, what does it now look like on the training end of things? So this is same across out there. Saw we're actually doing the same this in motion. So we're looking at reactionary drills. It's got to cut. It's got to respond. It's got to go through the lights out. It's got to make moves. It's got to pass on the things. To get a shot off. Show the it's able to get all the structures post office. So this was literally my college athlete. This was really getting in much. So hopefully that gives you guys a pretty good example. And then as we get this, we call lows on the 1080 for some of our stuff. So again, we want that multi-directional reaction. Making sure that they're able to be exposed to that stuff well before getting into actual sport with real contact and real pressures of, let's say, scoring a goal or what have you. I'm making sure that I'm using some of the tech that we have in front of us and doing some of these drills, right? Um, so this is kind of when we start combining a lot of these things, we should have an athlete that feels very prepared to get back to their sport and perform that sport at a very high level. Okay. And I have a couple more later stages. Demands are high. We're achieving really, really high speeds. We'll talk a little bit about the loads that I'm prescribing for stuff like this. But I'm more so wanted to show you guys what kind of things that we're actively doing at month 9 in our facility before we let these athletes just go back out into the field and playing their first game back. When you'll see talking, it's a little change direction, right? It's a little overspeed 505 drill where the 1080 assisted resistance is pulling you further forward. So your braking forces have to be really, really high. Your ability to control your body mass has to be really, really good. So again, demonstrating a little bit more of the abilities that the athletes have to have, and where we need to be at month 9 before we let them go out into the field, similar to the videos that you guys saw earlier. Okay, so let's talk real quick with the dosage of all this. So typically when I'm starting a lot of the assisted load exercises, so think assisted sprinting from the lateral start, that assisted 505 drill where we're really pulling the athlete forward, that they have to manage their center of mass, manage all their energy. I'm typically starting with about 3 to 4 kilograms, right? I don't want to have any sort of potential danger that the athlete has to experience. I'm just giving them a little bit more load than what their body mass is able to create on their own, a little bit more velocity compared to what their body mass can create on their own, and just I let the athletes show me really good control. And I might progress, some micro adjustments as far as the amount of load that I'm messing around with. For a little bit more of like the retreating reactive back pedal drill that you guys saw, right? I'm starting with about 3 to 5 kilograms, depends on the athlete's size a little bit. But my big thing with something like this is I want to make sure that as you're doing that backpedaling, the hip swiveling, that I'm not having the weight or the load alter their mechanics too much, right? I need it to stay authentic. I don't need them yanking and pulling that weight back against the belt. I just need them to show me that they can manipulate their body against that resistance and keep mechanics as authentic as possible, right? And then the other thing to keep in mind is we got to make sure that volumes are fairly low on some of these things because these are output-based drills. We're trying to make sure that athletes are showing us really high speeds, really high braking forces, really high power outputs in general. So I try to keep the volume overall fairly low. So 4 to 6 high quality reps good 1 to 2 minutes of break in between, right? So not getting too carried away and not all of a sudden turning this into a conditioning session. So then let's work the next step, right? So month 8. So to be able to get my athletes to do the things that you guys just saw in the month 9 video, what does month 8 need to look like, right? And I've kind of summarized some of these points, but to me, month 8 is all about controlled high outputs. Okay, so month 9 was adding a lot more of the reactionary change of direction, maybe even some contact. Um, that's a little bit less controlled. For month 8, I want a very controlled environment where they can safely achieve really high outputs of speed, um, power, velocity, change of direction, and all those things. Okay. So we'll kind of mess around with some max effort, change of direction, max effort, linear speed. We'll do a little bit of eccentric overload, change of direction stuff, maybe not as aggressive as what we did at month 9. We'll do some boxed reaction drills, meaning the athlete knows kind of what to expect. It's not like that foam roller dropping drill with the contact that you guys saw earlier today. And then I want to make sure that I'm hitting plenty of complex single leg, multi-planar power and plyo stuff. Okay. So let's look at some of these examples here. So before we get into the exercises that I might use with the 1080, I wanted to quickly show you guys what it looks like on the general training end, right? So something like a drop jump where we're asking for really fast ground contact times, really high outputs. These are stuff that I want to make sure that athletes are looking good and powerful in. And if I was to compare them to a healthy athlete, that their outputs would be similar, right? In a similar age group or category. Um, some overspeed, band assisted vertical jumping, right? Trying to get as much vertical velocity, but also really high vertical force. So we're kind of getting that like supra physiological ability to jump really high, but also handle the landing forces that comes from that. Okay. And then something like a hurdle hop here, where we're actually going at different heights. I want to show you guys this one again. So we're actually going at different heights. So we have to have the ability to manipulate different outputs. So we're going low to high hurdle hops. So we're faster off the ground on some of these, and a little bit slower off the ground, but then higher outputs on the higher hurdles. Right. So that's kind of, again, trying to match up the demands of the sport. Okay. Then I have a couple of our 1080 drills here. So let's see. So this is now shorter and tighter spaces, right? So all this is a assisted 5 yard sprint, and we're having to decel and cut sharply and turn back into a shuffle, right? So we're not achieving as high speeds as the 505 drill that we did at month 9, but this is still forcing the athlete to manipulate their body mass against an external eccentrically overloaded load with the 1080. And again, we'll talk dosages coming up. Right. And actually, this is actually the same video of the 505 because I wanted to show you guys that it's not just this very black and white system where we say, all right, month 8 drills look exactly like this, month 9 drills look exactly like this. Um, so with this athlete, it was just a lighter load for the eccentric overload on the 505, and we were just working our body's ability to control. So we were actually doing this drill on the left, that first video that I showed, and then this video of the 505 in conjunction with each other. My expectations weren't as high as they would be at month 9. We can use that same drill just under slightly different circumstances, right? This is here just a simple overspeed acceleration. So this is just now not going as far. So this might be a 15-yard overspeed sprint versus a 25-yard overspeed sprint. So we're not achieving as high of velocities that they have to manage, but I am still exposing them so that they get almost this like sense of practice to be able to handle that eccentrically overloaded sprint or that assisted sprinting with the 1080 device, where my expectations are going to be higher at month 9 to achieve higher speeds. We're going to try to be a little bit more technically sound on some of these things at month 9. But month 8 is a little bit of this like intro. Okay. So dosage for some of these things. So for some of the shorter decel drills, we'll start with that pretty standard, again, 3 to 5 kilograms. But for something shorter, because they're not able to achieve as high velocities, they just don't have as much space to build up the speed. We will slowly start progressing them up to about 8 kilograms, depending on the athlete, right? So there's a little bit more, I would say, force dominant of a drill versus if you lengthen that space out so that they achieve higher speeds, it's a little bit more of a velocity dominant drill, okay? For some of the assisted sprinting, I mentioned the slightly shorter distances, but we'll keep the weights fairly similar, right? I don't want to get too carried away with the assisted sprinting. What I've seen with my experience is that eventually when you start getting too much assisted assisted load into the overspeed sprinting, their mechanics change quite a bit. They start to get a little too reachy because they feel out of control with their body mass. So I like to keep the loads, sorry about that. I like to keep the loads fairly manageable. And I don't typically go much higher than a 5 kilogram load for the assisted sprinting that I've done so far. That might change over the course of time, but just from what I've seen with the abilities of my athletes, I've found mechanics to change in a negative manner when I've gone with loads that are too heavy, right? And then for jumps, just making sure that we're keeping an eye on the general training outside of the motorized resistance as well. I'm typically hitting 2 to 4 sets, 3 to 5 reps at really high efforts, right? And making sure that we're getting a good break in between. Again, we don't want to turn this into conditioning, right? This is still all about outputs. Okay, so now next up, month 7. Um, so again, through focuses, I want to make sure that we have goals and that we're achieving the goals that we've laid out. We want to make sure that we're really attacking the sagittal plane lower body power and the plyometric exercises, right? I want to start doing some higher intent, faster ground contact sagittal plyos. I'm going to slowly start progressing into a little bit more of the frontal plane, right? Things to basically get ready for things that we saw in month 8. Um, I'm going to slowly progress from the submaximal sprinting and get close to the 100% effort sprinting. And eventually at the end of month 7, I do want to be at 100% speed so that we can get into overspeed work at month 8 that you guys just saw. I'm doing a lot of resisted sprinting to target just general force qualities within the sprinting mechanic. Um, I am doing a good bit of single leg RFD focus for just general strength training exercises to make sure that I'm supplementing all our athletic movements with general baseline strength as well as general rate of force development work. Um, and then we are doing some eccentric overloaded exercises, and we're really tracking the asymmetry in power output for some of these things, right? So if we kind of touch on, and again, I don't want to overextend too much this talk, but as we're doing a lot of these things, we are tracking our athletes' isometric quad strength. We're tracking our counter movement jump, our one leg counter movement jump, and some of our other testing metrics that I'm not going to get too far into today. But I'm also using the motorized resistance of the 1080 as a way to overload the eccentric on an exercise, or let's say create a high resistance in the frontal plane, but I'm making sure that I'm really tracking my asymmetry as far as force outputs and power outputs. So I want to make sure that just because an athlete is good on, let's say, an isometric quad extension test, that they're just as good at showing me symmetry from that injured leg versus the non-injured leg on, let's say, something like a lateral bound or something that's a lot more demanding on the knee, right? So I've got a couple drills here that I'll show you again. So here you'll see a pretty complex sagittal plane drill, right? So this is a single leg broad jump, single leg triple broad jump, right? So I'm using an exercise like this to obviously challenge the athlete, but I want to make sure that I'm able to see the differences in my output for power from one leg to the other, right? And I'm going to choose my loads accordingly to make sure that they're still able to show me really high outputs, but I want to make sure that I'm tracking the progress of the asymmetry from injured leg to healthy leg week to week. And then on a lateral bound drill like this, right? Very simple. I actually just for those of you that have a 1080 Sprint 2 unit, I'll actually just have this on the open training on the rep setting, and it'll display the peak power output so they can do a lateral bound, look at the screen, and know what their power output for each jump is. They do the other side, and they can very quickly see, hey, do I have a discrepancy? Do I have any sort of asymmetry? And they'll just keep self-selecting to be able to work on that on their own. And then obviously I'll provide my coaching input as well to make sure that we're continually progressing, right? And then on something like this, right, working a little bit more of the intro to change direction stuff, I actually love a drill like this because you'll see a couple different important qualities here. So we have that initial hip swivel drop step, right? And I actually have this set up so that there's eccentric load and concentric load on the 1080. So we're using a slightly heavier assisted load, eccentric load, that when they get pulled back closer to the device, they have to manipulate their center of mass to be able to hit the brakes and control and show that balance, right? So you'll see this athlete actually doing a really good job of controlling their center mass and being able to hit the brakes when that machine pulls them back into that position, right? So then when we get into our general training, all right, some things that we're supplementing in the gym outside of just the motorized resistance, here's some of the things that we're trying to expose our athletes to, right? So fairly high outputs on a single leg jump, add some multi-directional component to it. They can show me really good knee stability, show me really good hip stability, and being able to control their mass on top of that leg that has a lot of now lateral stability demand from that quarter turn, right? Or something like a stagger stance broad jump, where we have a lot more demand on that front leg. So this would be really making sure that we're getting a good amount of symmetry on one leg versus the other, and just showing a good ability to have pretty good outputs on both sides. And I do this drill with a 1080, by the way, oftentimes, and track power outputs from each leg being the lead leg. Okay. And then something like a one leg plyo hurdle hop, right? So the month before we saw that alternating height one where we had to be able to manipulate our efforts from fast ground contact versus higher amplitude to get over the higher hurdles. This one is just slightly less complex. It's just, can you just show me repeatability to demonstrate good fast ground contact times, right? So that's kind of our regression down at this stage. Okay, so let's talk dosage. For any of the drills, let's say something like the single leg broad jump, the repeated broad jump, I'll start with 5 to 8 kilograms on the resistance. A lot of times what I'm actually doing with this one is it's a little bit of a science experiment. We're trying to find where the athlete is able to achieve peak power. And I try to stick on the loads that elicit the highest amount of power output, right? So if I have a certain amount of load and they're able to move that load very, very fast, they're going to have a higher power number. But let's say I have too much resistance on that device. Now they can't show me as much velocity because of that load. They're going to slowly have a point of diminishing returns on this. So I actually started just like ticking up the amount of resistance on the broad jump and figure out where they're sitting, where they achieve peak power output. Right. So there's a little bit of play here. And I would say if you have the device, I would recommend you do the same thing. Like I mentioned, I generally start with that like 5 to 8 kilogram range. Some athletes might get a little bit higher than that. Some athlete, you might, set 5 kilograms on the machine and you'll nail it on that first try, right? For something like that crossover to base variation, right? That hip swivel, that hip turn, and then that eccentric overload decel that I was mentioning. I'm typically starting this one with very low resisted, right? I don't really want to challenge them on that crossover position, going out away from the machine. I want this to be more of a decel drill. So I'm actually keeping the resistance low on the concentric phase. And then I'm keeping the assisted setting a little bit higher so that they have to have a lot more ability to hit the brakes on the way back being pulled towards that machine, right? So I'll typically do like a 3 to 6 kilogram range for the assisted load and 2 to 4 kilograms on the resisted load. For some of the jumps that you guys saw, I'll keep the volume fairly similar, right? 2 to 4 sets, 4 to 5 reps with really high outputs. Now, if it's something that's a little bit more about ground contact time is not as much high amplitude, meaning not getting as much height, not getting as much raw total effort per singular jump, like the repeated one leg plyo hurdle hops. I'll take this up to 8 to 12 reps, right? So I'm really just seeing what the demand for output is. So the demand for output is really, really maximal. I keep volume and reps really low. If the demand is not as high, I'll go slightly higher in repetitions there, right? And then making sure that we do have appropriate rest. And then the other thing that I do want to mention is, again, I don't have time to show every single drill that I might use, but making sure that we do really cover the extensive hopping and jumping too. Like we'll do some low-level hopping and jumping that is, let's say, 2 minutes straight of hopping to make sure that we're preparing our tissues, the ligament, the tendon, right? We'll kind of talk about grafts later on, but let's say if we have a patellar tendon graft, I also got to make sure that I'm training and putting load on that patellar tendon graft so we actually get that graft to adapt, right? And the patellar tendon, even on the non-affected side, had a period of time where it wasn't stressed as much. So I got to make sure that I'm, building capacity within that patellar tendon to be able to handle some of the stressors that are coming up or some of the stresses that you guys have actually already seen at month 8, month 9, right? Covers us through month 7. So month 6, what does that look like, right? So our general focus is here is we're introducing a good bit of submaximal sprinting, right? And I do want to differentiate in our eyes, we separate our running slash jogging, which we'll talk about coming up, versus our intro to sprinting, right? There's just a higher level of effort when you start getting into the sprinting, right? Typically that 70% range is what we'd call like a tempo sprint. So in month 6, we're starting to introduce a little bit more of the tempo sprints, right? We're really starting to push our sagittal plane double-legged power. We're starting to introduce some of our frontal plane power work. And we're really working some linear decel, and we're definitely doing some of that linear decel with some eccentric overload. And we're also introducing some lower level lateral deceleration work. Okay. And then we're also going to introduce some single leg rate of force development strength exercises, as long as the limb symmetry index is good, right? So I kind of mentioned this for the month 7 program, but we're actually starting some of these RFD focus traditional strength training exercises fairly early on so that we can make sure that it's not just raw force production that our athletes are good at, that they're also able to have that force production happen very quickly, right? And then the other one that we love using the 1080 for is we hammer some quad isolated overload eccentric work, as well as some isokinetic work, which you guys will see examples of coming up, where we're really trying to push max force production on that isolated quad, right? One of my mentors, Lenny, who's one of the co-owners of Champion, right? I learned this from him 10 years ago. And he actually goes around saying this all the time, all day long. Quad is king. Quad is king, right? So something for like an ACL, we got to make sure that the quads are incredibly strong. So we take our time to hammer some of our eccentric overload quad, and some isokinetic, max effort concentric quad. So let's look at some of our examples here. So you guys will see on
Okay.
this first video that we have a deceleration drill with a step back. So I have the machine set to have an assisted load where the machine is pulling this athlete forward. She's got to be able to hit the brakes, that knee's traveling forward, and then be able to transition that eccentric overload force to be able to come back and kind of push back. And then, like I mentioned, we're introducing a little bit of the lateral decel as well. So there's some resistance going out into that shuffle, but there's also resistance being pulled back towards that device, right, towards the 1080. So we have to be able to hit the brakes really well in that frontal plane movement. Okay. Another good example here. This is actually that same lacrosse athlete that you guys saw a couple examples of, but this is just a back pedal with an overloaded eccentric, where when the machine pulls them forward when they're coming back into that sprint, there's a lot of load that they have to manage on that knee. So there's a lot of stress on the patellar. There's a good amount of stress on the patellar tendon. There's a good amount of stress on the quad tendon if there's a quad tendon graft, and the knee as a whole, right? But this is the general properties that we got to make sure that we're really covering at around month 6. Okay. So those are some of the examples of the ways that we've used the 1080, right? And then for some of our general strength training, right? Again, making sure that we don't forget about that. We're doing some pretty aggressive weighted vertical jumping. Started a video that I did not want. So you guys will see some pretty high effort vertical jumps. We have some external load on there. So we've got a good amount of power output here on 2 legs. Introducing some of our frontal plane stuff, right? Doing some lateral bounding variations. We'll do this just body weight. We'll also do this on the 1080 if we want to track some of our progress in power, right? You guys saw an example of that against the resistance, in that month 7 program. But we'll even mess around with like very, very low weight just so we can have almost like a tracker on the device, because all of our athletes do respond really well to just seeing outputs. Okay. And then here is our isolated quad work here. So you guys will see here, right? We have an overloaded eccentric. So we have not a whole lot of concentric load, but on the way back, there's way more eccentric overload happening here. And I want to say this was about 100% eccentric overload. So the athlete has to really control that way back, show some really good quad control, show really good ability to lengthen at the quad while being able to handle that stress, right? And then I briefly mentioned our rate of force development work when it comes to our general strength training. So this is a barbell velocity tracker. We've got a short box step up, and we have a target velocity that I want the athlete to achieve. So it's not just about having, weight on the bar and just say go do a step up, right? As you see them kind of zooming in. We have a target velocity of 0.75 meters per second, and I'm making sure that the athlete is able to use that quad fast, use the rest of the lower leg complex really fast to be able to move, that's 185 pounds on the bar, to be able to move that bar fast, right? Because just general force is not quite enough. We know that the rate of force is highly important as well. So let's now talk dosage for this. Okay. So for any of our decel steps, for sagittal plane stuff, I'll actually push the loads of the assisted setting pretty high. Um, I'll go up as high as 12 kilograms, right? And that's pretty heavy, by the way. For those of you that have not messed around with this, That's not to say that I'll start with 12 kilograms right away, but I've had athletes even, within one session, maybe set number one starts with 6 or 7 kilograms, and they're like, "Oh, I want more. I can handle more." Right. So the example that I'm thinking is that back pedal one that you guys saw. So backpedaling against the resistance of the 1080, and then the 1080 pulls you back forward with more assisted load, and being able to hit the brakes on that. Good athletes are able to handle a good bit of load, up to 12-ish kilograms. For the lateral decel, definitely lighter. For my smaller athletes, I'm sticking closer to the 4, 5, 6. If I have a heavier athlete, just a generally stronger athlete, I'll take them up to 8 kilograms. But again, something where I'm setting them up for success to show me good control and not just try to blow through their abilities and, try to like see them fail basically. I'm definitely more about trying to see my athletes find success within the prescribed loads rather than trying to make it incredibly hard and they walk out of the session saying, wow, that was insanely difficult, right? I want it to be challenging, but manageable. For any of the decel work, it's kind of in the name. The focus is the decel. The focus is the eccentric overload or managing the assisted load. So I keep the resistance on the resisted portion fairly low, right? Because I don't want to tax them out on a quality that I'm not necessarily working on. I'm working on my general concentric abilities with some of the RFD work that you guys just saw, some of my other exercises like our jumping variations. So I really want to make sure that I'm being specific with what qualities I'm trying to build on when I'm putting them on the 1080 and I'm selecting some of my loads, right? So I'm kind of having that mindset of saving my bullets of general fatigue so that I can use those bullets on the eccentrically overload assisted portion of the qualities that I'm trying to develop, right? And then something like the leg extension with eccentric overload, like I mentioned, pretty wide range here. I wouldn't go crazy right away, but we'll go anywhere from 50% overload to 150% overload. This particular one was a little bit on the lower side. It was 12 kilograms on the concentric, 16 kilograms on the eccentric. But again, I would definitely recommend playing around with this. Not every athlete is the same. We know that. But that general range, I know it's a little big. It's 100% different actually. But you really do have to kind of play around with this a little bit. It's hard to have an exact, here's how much you should start with. So just make sure that you keep your athletes safe. So as we're kind of blowing through this, right, we're getting close, month 5. What do we need to be doing at month 5? So at month 5, we're starting to introduce now closer to 50% submaximal sprinting. This actually happens, and we have a very clear target for everyone that's checked off all of our markers. At around week 22, we're introducing 50% sprinting, right? And we have eyes on the athlete. We're making sure that we're getting feedback from, them as far as how they feel on the decel coming down from the sprint. This one's a little overlooked. Um, so I want to make sure that we have control and eyes on that. We're progressing some of the eccentric overload deceleration, lunging and hopping, right? As you guys can, tell, hopefully, the reason I put the two together is a big part of sprinting is coming back down from that sprint and decelling, right? That's why we're doing eccentric overloaded decelerations as part of month 5, because at month 6, you got to be able to handle 70% sprinting and the decel that, comes with that. So that's why month 5, it's a preparatory phase for deceleration work, right? And you guys will see examples there. We're progressing a lot more of our single leg hopping drills. We're introducing a little bit of change of direction work, and just teaching athletes how to just manipulate their center of mass a little bit. And we're doing more or less the same as far as hammering quad accessory work, right? So we're obviously doing our squats, our lunges, and all of our compound movements, but using the 1080, we're doing a lot of quad eccentric overload. And I'm going to show you guys an example of the isokinetic here in a second. But we're doing a lot of isokinetic work as well to really push outputs on the concentric end and then also push qualities on the eccentric end. Okay. So we'll see some examples here. So we have a very similar decel drill, but this time we're not doing a step back out of it. We're just controlling and having a really good motor control of that knee and hip to make sure that we're not creating too much valgus torque, and that we're able to control the valgus torque that does happen. I'm actually going to back this up real quick because there's a little bit of nuance to this that I want to talk about. So here you guys will actually see the athlete's holding the cable with her right arm and hopping on the left leg, right? So we'll call this a contralaterally loaded eccentric overload decel drill. And then she's going to switch arms. So now we have a lot more of an ipsilateral load. And this is going to change. And you'll see she struggled on that very first rep is there's a lot more of an external rotation bias force at the hip joint. on this ipsilateral load versus on the contralateral load, right? And I want to expose them to both. So very simple, same drill, but I take away the step back. It's a lot more manageable in the early stages. And then I do want to cause more variability. So I'm messing around with contralaterally loaded versus ipsilaterally loaded. And you'll see here, right, not hopping now, right, because hopping is a lot more force to have to manage, a lot more stress on the knee to have to manage. We're doing a forward lunge where we have an assisted load from the 1080 pulling the athlete forward. They got to be able to hit the brakes and then push back out of it. So this is that earlier stage where we're introducing a lot more of the deceleration qualities. We'll see here, right? This one is now just some resisted switches. So this is our intro into some, single leg hopping type, running exercises. So this is your classic track drill and a switch where we're getting really quick replacement of one leg over the other. And we have just a little bit of feedback from the 1080. And the reason I actually like this, I think most people would not guess as to why, is I actually like the way that the 1080 gives you resistance, so you can actually lean forward and create a little bit of this body tilt, similar to what you're doing for acceleration work. All right, so the resistance of the hips just allows you to be a little bit forward instead of being completely upright. I want to kind of work on managing that forward angled torso because that's some of the stuff coming up in the next program, which you guys saw before was about 70% sprinting, right? So just preparation for those. And then I had mentioned some of the other things that we're doing, right? Hopefully this starts to look fairly linear in progression. So on the last phases, you guys saw a continuous single leg hurdle hop, right? On this, we're doing a little prep hop, right? We call it just a double hop, where we have one high output, a little mini bounce to kind of prep the tissue, and also give the tissue a chance to, recoil and demonstrate that elasticity, because that's not going to come very easily in the early stages of rehab. So this is kind of our slight regression from that continuous single leg hurdle hopping, right? And then I had mentioned our introduction to change direction work, right? Let me actually make this a little bit bigger. This one's really cool. Um, so this is just showing the ability to change center of mass and change stance legs over a riser, right? So it's just, can you stick that landing? Can you show good body control? Can you make sure that that mass is not continuing to move with the other leg? So you'll see this athlete, I'll play one more time, does a really good job of stacking head, chest, the knee, and the foot that's up on the platform, and stacking all of that vertically as they change their center of mass laterally. Quickly talk dosage, right? I think we've kind of covered a lot of the things about hopping and jumping and some of the power and plyo exercises. So what I would say for some of the decel exercises that you guys saw earlier is for the hopping variations, I'll start lighter, right? So like the single leg hopping forward, holding the handle. I'll start with 3 to 4-ish kilograms on something like that because I do want to make sure that they're showing really good, motor control of that knee and the hip. But then for the lunging and stepping variations, I can push the load because they're not leaving the ground and hopping. They're simply stepping forwards. It's a lot more easier to manage there, right? So I'll push that up to, 10 kilograms. I'm maybe starting them with 6. Some of our bigger athletes have actually gone, 12, 14, 16 kilograms. Um, but those are some exceptional athletes at early stages. It's not going to happen with everyone. All right, so now we're at month 4. So this is kind of the start of our journey, right? So at month 4, we're starting to introduce some low resisted marching. We're introducing a little bit of jogging as long as LSI is greater than 80%. We're starting to do some low level eccentric overload decel, right? So some of the same decel drills that you guys saw earlier. We're going to do a little bit of that, but just easier to manage for the athlete. And I'll show you guys examples. We're doing some low level single leg hopping. We're starting to push a little bit of the 2 leg jumping. And we're still hammering quad accessory, right? In Lenny's wise words, quad is king. So we're going to keep hammering. That's something that the PTs are, crushing them with right away when they start rehab, right after surgery. But even up until month 4, month 5, on the gym side, we're definitely pushing quad in an isolated fashion. And then our compound exercises like our squats, our deadlifts, our lunges, as long as the athlete is not painful, puffy, swollen, some of our good health, like athletes that are progressing as we expect, they're starting to do some pretty heavy sets of 5, 6 reps on a squat or a lunge or something like that. Right? So let's see some of the examples of what we're doing out in the gym. So I mentioned the heavy marching, right? So this is really good body lean, forcing the athlete to show pretty good symmetry in that ability to get extension on that leg in a forceful manner. I'll show this again. This one will load it up pretty heavy. For this one, I actually really like setting it on the isokinetic, where I'll actually limit the speed that the athlete is able to do. And I'll talk a little bit about the specifics on the dosage section. But that's one of the things that I really loved about the 1080 is I can manipulate eccentric concentric load, but I can also manipulate eccentric and concentric velocity to really get the qualities that I'm looking for, right? This example, I mentioned the lower level decel work, right? So a walking lunge where they're not having to go from eccentric control into pushing back into the concentric, they're just going from one leg to the other. So it's just a continuous walking lunge where the load is pulling them forward. So every single step, they just have to hit the brakes a little bit, control their body, control how much that knee goes forward, right? Which we do want forward knee translation, but we don't want to take it to the point where that heel's coming up off the ground or they're showing lack of control in the frontal plane, right? We don't want knee wobbling side to side. So this ends up being a pretty accessible drill, even in that early stage of that like month 4 mark, right? And then you guys will see here, right? This one's a grind. So this is our isokinetic quad, right? So you might think like, oh, why is this athlete moving so slow? She's got a big smile there because it's hard. I want to say I had this set to like zero point 0.2 meters per second. So this is like real slow. She's working as hard as she can, and the resistance and the motor of the 1080 is not going to allow her to move any faster than 2 meters per second. Sorry, zero point 0.2 meters per second. So she's having to be putting a lot of force into that machine. So that isolated quad is experiencing something pretty close to maximal force, right? Without it being an isometric, obviously. So an isotonic exercise done with isokinetic resistance, where we can just experience really high forces isolated on the quad. Okay. So then let's look at some of the other things that we're maybe doing on the gym. From a hopping perspective, right, we're doing some band assisted, so we're making our body mass a little bit lighter, faster ground contact times, but it's low pogos, right? We're doing it that way because we don't want high outputs right now. We're using this kind of in the preparatory phase as kind of our early extensive plyometric work, right? And then with two-legged stuff, we will push a little bit more. So we're doing a little bit more clusters, right? Connecting multiple jumps in a row where outputs are fairly high, but they also have to control their eccentric, braking, and concentric phases within the jump and show pretty good control of that, right? And then we're even doing a little bit of resisted jumping stuff so we can expose them to some higher power outputs. But you guys saw 2 months after this, at month 6, we were doing some weighted repeated. So we're just not asking as much of a demand, but for athletes that are feeling good, and again, they have to make sure that LSI is pretty good. They're not super puffy, they're not painful, range of motion is really good, and they've been doing some heavy squats and stuff like that. We can get them doing some weighted vertical jumping because the two leg is not quite as stressful on the ACL there, right? So then dosage for some of this stuff, right? As I mentioned, for some of the isokinetic quad stuff, I like going real slow, right? Zero point 0.2 meters per second is grueling slow. And this is where I would recommend playing around with a little bit too, because it is going to be a little bit different athlete to athlete. I would just go, a little micro adjustment at a time, bump up the speed or bump down the speed and see what it does to the force outputs that the 1080 shows, right? If you select the speed that's, let's say, zero point 0.3 and they end up moving pretty fast, but then the force output is lower, that means you went too fast, right? So slow them back down and try to really elicit some high forces because that's the thing that we're chasing, right? We're not trying to chase power here. We're trying to just chase raw force. So something that you guys can play around with. For the marching variations, like I said, I love setting a resisted speed limit. I'll typically play from like a zero point 0.5 meters per second to 0.75 meters per second. The zero point 0.5 is pretty grueling. It's slow. It really forces them to complete their push into the ground, get a really good triple extension, show some really good ankle stiffness, while maintaining that really good forward lean in the body. So this is a good way to start exposing them to some of the demands of the running coming up in that next program, right? And then as I'm doing this, right, I'm observing the output. So even on the isokinetic quad, I'll have them actually do it on both sides, their injured side versus the healthy side, and I'll track the outputs there. Sorry, I'll track the outputs there in force and give them some feedback and let them know like, hey, like we're getting better at this. Like the symmetry is getting, closer. And then same thing even on the marching, we can actually pull up the graph of the force and figure out exactly how much one side is working versus the other and try to get a little bit of an asymmetry index for something a little bit more, athletic looking like we're at the end. So if we nailed it, here's a couple things, right? And there's a nice little graphic. But if we nailed it, so we started at month 9 and we worked our way all the way back to the foundational phases of month 4, 5, and 6. But if we were to kind of redo this presentation starting at month 4 and work our way back up to month 9, it should really look like a really good progression model where everything is preparing itself for the next phase coming up, right? So that's kind of our hope. So here's my general words of wisdom after talking about this for a little bit over 45 minutes. Start with the needs and the demands of the sport. So that little thing that we did at the very beginning where we asked, all right, for a typical field sport athlete, what do we really need to make sure that we're getting them back to? What are we making sure that we're getting them prepared for? Start with that, right? If you're just going with it without a game plan of what we need to get accomplished by the time they're getting ready for back to sport, I think we're going to maybe miss on some of these things. And I'll literally write it down for a lot of my athletes still. And when I'm mentoring my younger coaches, I definitely make them write it down so we figure out what are the real demands and what are the things that we can do to prep and train that in the gym. Start with the athletic qualities to maximize, not the exercises. I know it's easy to see a bunch of, cool exercises, maybe even some of the exercises that I showed in this presentation, and you might think, all right, that was a cool exercise. I'm going to play around with this in my return to sport program. I would say, don't do that. Start with the athletic qualities that you need to develop at that certain stage within that rehab process and figure out what exercises exist to maybe fill those athletic qualities, right? I think that mindset is very, very important because otherwise I think we're going to miss the forest for the trees, as they say, where the exercise really should be the vessel to accomplish some of the things that we're trying to do to build back the athleticism and build back the qualities that are required. Um, so start with the general, make the exercises fit the qualities that you're trying to develop. The other thing to keep in mind is, man, ACL rehab is complicated, right? There's a lot happening. You're going to get athletes that play different sports. You might get a football player, a soccer player, a basketball player. The demands are different. You might have an athlete that has a patellar tendon graft, a hamstring graft, a quad tendon graft. Right, the Bear procedure's gotten pretty popular now. So there's a lot of different potential things that are going to be a little bit unique for each surgery and each athlete. Make sure that you understand some of those differences. Make sure you understand what to expect when it comes to a quad tendon graft versus a patellar tendon graft, right? The patellar tendon people, for example, don't handle a ton of, heavy jumping, hopping early on. The quad tendon people don't handle a whole lot of deeper knee bending early on or even later on, right? I have athletes that are 7 months into the rehab process and a deep squat still bugs their quad tendon, right? It's just how it is. So make sure that you understand some of those things and that you're prepared for it will definitely help you in the process. Um, and then, yeah, like I mentioned, start to understand some of the nuance of the graphs. Definitely do some research. There's a lot of good information that you can find on research articles. Find some good mentors that can teach you some of the basics. Maybe you can connect with surgeons. I try to be pretty involved as far as talking to our PTs to make sure that I understand this from the strength conditioning world, so I have some, appropriate expectations for some of these things. But I know on the other side, I know our PTs are doing a really good job of communicating with surgeons so they understand from the surgery side, right? So as long as we're prepared for every level of it through each of our disciplines, we should be pretty well prepared to handle and serve some of our athletes. Collaborate, stay educated, be patient, embrace problem solving. The ACL rehab process is so much problem solving, right? And it requires a lot of patience. The patient and the client, I would say definitely teach them some semblance of patience because it's really hard on them. You're gonna have to be an emotional support system for them. But it's also gonna get challenging for you because things aren't always gonna be super, super easy, black and white. Here's steps 1 through 10 to follow. So definitely be patient. The more you do it, the more of these you see, hopefully you're gonna get better. But that's really all for me. I want to just say thank you to Adam, Matt, Ola, Jesse, all the 1080 guys for having me on. It's an honor to just speak for 1080. I'm a user. I've been using the machine for almost 2 years now, and it's been epic, right? I was telling Matt this story, but like, man, this must have been almost 10 years ago. I tried to convince my boss, Mike Reinhold, to get a 1080 machine. And I had it. He told me to come up with a wish list. If I could create my ultimate gym somewhere down the line, which I got to do by the way in the last 4 months, which is really cool. But he told me to come up with a wish list of items that I would want in like my ultimate private facility gym. And 1080 was on there, and it was on there for a long time. It sat on that list for 8 years. So for me to get my hands on this machine and finally get to use it consistently has been epic. And it's definitely made me better as a strength coach. It's made my systems better. So yeah, I can't say enough about it. I'm gonna stop my screen share so you guys don't have to look at that pop up. Um, but that's all I had.
You had a lot there. All is oh, you had a lot today. That was really, really good. I know Ola's sitting there impressed, not even knowing what to say yet. So, hey, I do my first question for you. Um, One of the biggest things of feedback I hear when people start using the 1080 for return to play specifically is how the coach is interacting with the data with the athlete. So maybe you can just speak a little bit the psychology of it, what you've noticed with athletes starting to use the sprint, like on that end stage, where are they getting more confidence out of it? Are you showing them the data? Like how does that working from a coach standpoint?
That's a great question. That's also a very nuanced question. We know the difference in psychology from athlete to athlete.
Yeah.
Some athletes can look at a piece of data and be so objective with it, and they're, weirdly mature, and they can say, "I know I'm not going to be perfect right now. I know that, my coach is trying to show me that I have a little bit of discrepancy, that I need to get better at this, and I'm working on it." And they respond really well to being shown the data, even if it's, "Hey, you're actually not very good at this exercise or, this kind of output yet," and they feed off of that. And then we have the other athlete type that you show them the data, you show them that, they're asymmetrical by 15%. And, in the back of our head, like we know you're supposed to be asymmetrical, like that's what we're trying to work on actively, but that beats them down. So to answer your question, it's not a black and white. Like I'm not showing the data to everyone. I'm kind of thinking through the process. If I have an athlete that feeds off of numbers and can be pretty objective and not super emotional, I'm going to show them the data. If I have an athlete that's a little bit less confident in themselves and they tend to beat themselves up a little bit more, um, I'm usually hiding the data from them, and I just keep saying, "No, that look good. We're good. We're good." And I might show them 4 weeks later after having done a
Mm,
drill, show them the progress and say, "Look at this.
yeah.
Like week one, like you actually didn't look very good. But week four, as we've continually worked on this, quality, it's gotten worlds better." So yeah, it's fairly
No, that makes
nuanced.
sense.
I try to pay attention to the athlete, psyche a little bit more, kind of in the
Yeah.
early process, and just be mindful of that.
What kind of riffing off that, and then the other guys want to jump in. Another question I had was just when you got to month 4 and you're having the athlete come in and you said big smile, which I love because when you do isokinetics for the first time and you're kind of setting up the box and you're doing it, like how did that little box make this so hard? Is kind of the realization of the athlete, and you were using like 0.2 meters per second for
Yeah.
isokinetic, just good knee extension quad loading. Are there some athletes that you're expanding that longer than, like later in the stage? Are you still using that as just
Oh yeah.
because you showed a lot of really good progressions of strength and now power on that performance spectrum, but I just kind of wondered. I know I talked to some people that they're like, hey, I'm always using isokinetics. I'm just using that. Quad is king. We're just going to make sure that's a staple all the way to the end of their rehab. Maybe could you talk a little bit your experience?
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely could have made that a little bit more clear in the presentation. We're using it throughout the entire time. And even when they're healthy, like to use that lacrosse athlete that you guys saw a couple of times as an example, he also trained in season with me. So he'd come in once a week, and we were still hammering isokinetic quad just to make sure that the quad wasn't getting weaker, right? Because we know that over the course of an athletic season, athletes get tight, tired, and weak. Those are the trifecta of doom, as I'd like to call it. So I want to make sure that I'm mitigating at least the weak in the tight, tired, and weak. Um, and to me, that means from a holistic perspective with our compound movements, but also means for something that's so, specific, like an ACL rehab, like I want to make sure the quad's not getting weaker at all. So yeah, like all 28 months of making sure the athlete's coming back from an ACL surgery, I'm using isokinetic. I'm still using the eccentric overloaded quad extensions. Yeah, for sure.
Nice. We have time for probably two more questions. Anybody on the panel here? Do you guys have a question? Because I have some more if you don't. that came in.
It's not so much a question, but it's more of a I'm very happy and very pleased to see that you use your isokinetic setting for like different locomotive patterns because I think they're fantastic. So I just want to give you a shout out for doing that, but also for the other people listening. Try it,
Mm.
play with it, feel it.
Yeah. Yeah,
You,
even retro
you,
walking, like I didn't put this in the presentation because
Hmm.
yeah,
obviously, again, I didn't want it to be a 4 hour presentation, but man, like, yeah, the forward marching is cool, but you can go pretty early on. Like
yeah,
our 2 month ACLs are doing retro walking against an isokinetic resistance from the 1080 and getting a
What's what?
massive quad burn. Heck, we'll throw BFR cuffs on that early on and like do retro walking with BFR plus the 1080 isokinetic, and that is quad like destruction, but in such a good way, right? Like we know we got to get quad back and we got to get quad strong.
What kind
That's
of
been the goal.
what kind of cute? Yeah, no, I totally agree. That's my first one. Maybe
Hmm.
my maybe I'll do weight shifts before that, but retro walking is like on my
Mm,
to-do list. Like just do it.
yeah.
What kind of speeds do you usually put up on that, just to give people a sense of like what they could play with?
Yeah, pretty similar. Like that 0.4 meters per second ish tends
Uh,
to be
Yep.
pretty good. When you get really slow on that, I I've played around personally before, I prescribe it to someone else.
Makes sense.
Um, but I've tried like 0.2 meters per second on me, and that is just like it gets weird because you start like yanking against resistance,
Yeah,
instead of just like walking and pushing and getting really good extension of that knee.
yeah.
Um,
I,
so
I, I
point,
agree
point
with you.
0.4, point 0.5, point 0.6, yeah.
Yeah, that's usually where I'm at too. And also like the key instruction here, I think if you're gonna use it, because if you use isokinetic and you kind of like you go in and out of the speed, you
Yeah.
just have to instruct. I know this is gonna hurt. I know this is gonna be burning, but I just want you to grind it, grind it, grind it, steady, 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 no break, no steady, steady. Okay, break.
Yeah.
That's like 10 steps.
Yep.
Then they're like, okay, we're done. Next, we'll take a little break and
Well,
then we go.
well, and one of the things, Dewish, you said that was really good today, that you're a coach, so you communicate with your athletes. You're not sitting there over on your phone and you're doing this and they're just doing exercises. Like you are clearly you are locked in, and you need to be locked in when you're using this kind of stuff, right? Like you need to be getting feedback all the time. You made that comment. I just want to highlight that of, you know, when you're changing assisted loads and someone's like, no, 6 kg is too light, I want to go a little heavier. Like you can, it's okay to do that, but do it with the communication,
Mhm.
especially when you're on a one-on-one setting. Like in a team setting, that could be a little bit different. We got a bunch of guys. We're going to be more strategic. Everybody's doing this. Maybe it's too heavy, or maybe it's too light for that person. We're underloading it a little bit, but we're being conservative. You have that opportunity here with a 1080 that you can be, and then you have the data right there to say,
Mhm.
yeah, you're right. That is too much, or no, you can go more. So I just wanted to highlight that that's so important and necessary in this profession. Jesse, go ahead and ask your question, man. We'll wrap up here
Yeah,
soon.
thanks, Diwesh. I think, as Ola mentioned, this is such an emerging field, not only for us, but 1080 in general into this rehab space. So I think you did a really good job of outlining what it can do. My question is, I guess it's somewhat earlier in the process that you presented, but obviously restoring muscle mass and quad bulk and just muscle mass in general, the atrophy that results from the surgery, regardless of graft. How have you implemented, I guess, 1080 to almost maximize hypertrophy within those phases? Because obviously that's, it's a long-term adaptation that takes place when we talk about hypertrophy and restoring muscle mass. Could you maybe speak to some of the dosages, resistance settings, that kind of thing that you've thought through for restoring muscle mass?
Yeah, for sure. And I should say, I feel like I maybe held that on you guys a little bit. We get our athletes on the performance side like to see me as early as month 3. So
Nice.
I maybe gypped you guys a little bit. Um, but yeah, like at that stage, right? Like most of our athletes don't have muscle mass fully back yet. They do have a good amount of atrophy. So and I mentioned this briefly, but we'll throw BFR cuffs on. We'll go standard leg extension. We'll go eccentric overloaded leg extension. We'll go isokinetic leg extension, and just isolate, 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 right? And then some of the other vessels like the marching, the retro walking, all those become like additional accessory work that we can just keep pushing on. And then, not to forget about the hamstring and stuff too. Like we'll go prone hamstring curls with eccentric overload on the 1080, right? So those are other things that I will continually use. And then the other thing that I'll just quickly say is like um, even before that 12-month mark or that 12-week mark, our team of PTs are so good, and they're so good at understanding the loading perspectives and the loading principles and stuff. So they're using these tools pretty early on at week 8, week 7. So the retro walking with VFR, like I see our PTs do that all the time, right? And I know that the quality that they're trying to chase this is gain some of that muscle mass back to mitigate some of that atrophy. So yeah, those are probably our most frequently used tools.
Okay, Ola. I just because you're Ola, I will let you have one more question, and then we're gonna wrap this thing up.
Yeah, I know, but I find this a very interesting conversation. Could you share a little bit, like when you're able to introduce like locomotive strategies, like you're saying with the retro walk earlier, what do the patients tell you? What's the feedback from your patient population from that introduction? What is it that you're observing? Nonverbal, verbal.
I'll tell you the most frequent one at the very, very beginning. Man, this feels weird. Right? It's just so different. It's not like most of our kids at some point have picked up a dumbbell or, used a cable machine and done like a standard thing. When they feel a resistance that's just like they don't know how to describe it because they push hard and they push harder and it just limits you. It's a weird feeling for them. So the first one is it feels weird. And then the second one is actually really cool, right? They're like, oh, like I think my body's starting to figure this out. Like if I just like feel the ground and continue to feel that push into the ground, let's say on a forward march or on a retro walk, like they feel like they're engaged into the ground really well. And they're not having to overthink like, oh, do I use my quad? Do I use my hamstring? Like, coach, what do I do? Like, no, it's just like you're using the ground and you feel that push and you feel the completion of the push into a march or a retro walk. And they just kind of self-select, figure it out. And now all of a sudden it looks kind of rhythmic, right? It looks like they're just walking or they're just walking backwards. Versus early on, they're like, man, it feels weird. In that phase, they're like a little hitchy, right? They take one step and like the resistance kind of like bottoms out on them because they have like a little bit of like forward body movement or on a forward march, their hips kind of shoot backwards and the resistance kind of like tops out on the eccentric portion. So yeah, it's a lot of like self-learning that they I think find cool.
No, because it's just interesting to see. Well, and if you then coach too much, that's
Mm,
just control strategies, trying to figure it out. Like, how do I solve this? You know,
yeah.
you give them a task. Here's
Mhm.
the constraint. Figure it
Yeah.
out. Cool. All right. I'm going to be quiet, Adam. I
You
promise.
did great. No, we're good. Well, I mean, these are always hard because we just want to keep digging and digging, but we really appreciate your time today, and we had a really good audience, a great attendance here, and so there's a lot of people you helped today, which is fantastic. Matt Tomitz, I want you to tell everybody if they like this kind of content. I believe 1080 Health would be a good place to start to follow. Would that be right?
Yes. So a more dedicated page to explicitly kind of say, do dive a little bit deeper into the weeds of, motorized resistance, health, even if it's more just kind of general education, where, we have assisted sprinting at 11 meters a second, right? Like that's cool and that's motorized resistance, but it's a little different than like a, 8-week post-op retro walk. So we're diving into this space. It's something we've always kind of done, but now we have high-level practitioners like Diwesh and Ola, our 1080 Viking, kind of leading the way. So it's simple. It's a motor. It's resistance. It's data, but it helps practitioners do high-level stuff. So we're excited to kind of grow and evolve in the health and rehab space. So take a peek at that IG, and you can find more stuff like this for sure.